Jordan Peterson has invited us all onto the ark. Is he Noah? Is he a type of Noah, or is the ark just a club of people that get together to gripe and moan and complain about the oncoming tyrannical forms of government, which, we can all do that at home. So is it something more? Is it more meaningful than that? That's what we're going to unpack today. So I'm glad that you're with me. It's an invitation to a dialogue. So here's the dialogue part of the monologue. So he gave the monologue. We're going to respond with a bit of dialogue.
First of all, we thought we would put forward something approximating a vision. And we tried to talk about the dimensions along which this vision might elaborate itself. But then after thinking about it a lot, we realized it would be better to put forward an invitation to participate in a discussion that's centered on a number of questions. The questioning approach is a better one because it's an invitation rather than a top-down imposition of the principles that must be. We also decided that one of our guiding principles would be that we're not going to formulate policies that would require compulsion or the imposition of state power to implement. So, here's an example.
Okay. So yeah, he's setting the stage here. It's interesting. He's positioning it in the sense of okay, so here's an invitation to a dialogue. That is really the purpose of this channel is, you hear a lot of stuff like this out on the internet, but is it possible to have an expanded dialogue through the internet, almost like you would person to person, but in a broad way? Socrates wrestled with this question as a philosopher. He was a master of dialogue, and dialogue is best had with small groups of people, individual, maybe a small group. And he didn't have the broad reach of the poets and the playwrights of his day. So when he was put on trial, he lost. So that's the philosopher doesn't have a wide scoping reach like the poets and the playwrights, like the media companies do today. The philosopher, maybe using the internet as a tool, could potentially have that broader reach through dialogue. So it's an interesting question. So there's the dialogue part of it. And I think dialogue is very powerful. And I hope, rather than I think, that it is possible in our day today. The other interesting thing about this is that he's setting up dialogue versus tyranny. The top-down approach is what he's saying. It's just somebody prescribing what you ought to do. That's tyranny. And dialogue comes in as the antidote to that tyranny in a way, or that might be our hope. So if we were to try to summarize the important question in front of us is, can we as individuals collectively meet the challenges of modern life and stave off the approach of tyrannical forms of government? Let me know what you think. And we are jumping around a little bit. We want to do a kind of a deep dive and unpacking of what Jordan is saying in this video. The whole thing takes an hour long, and there's a lot here. He doesn't really unpack. He unpacks it as best he can in an hour. So our hope is to focus on some of the more meaningful things, at least as far as I'm concerned, without being tedious. Okay, so we're hoping this doesn't take too long, but it's going to be an effort because it's meaningful, it's purposeful. We want to think critically about these things. We don't want to just bob around in this world. I'm so tired of people just complaining and bickering about the state of things and not doing anything about it. And so is this Jordan's attempt to do something about it? Is this our invitation to do something about it? Let's see. So if you need to bookmark this or pause it and come back, I would recommend doing that, or grab a cup of coffee and buckle in.
Which was probably the issue that caused us the most trouble, actually, it's called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. The Alliance.
Is that ironic that the thing that they had the most trouble doing is naming the dang thing?
Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. We like that name because, well, if you're a citizen, then you're an autonomous individual. And if you're a responsible citizen, then you're the kind of autonomous individual that can take care of yourself and maybe some other people, and that would be a good thing. And if it's an alliance, then, well, the implication there is that citizens who are responsible can aggregate in something approximating responsible groups that also take responsibility for developing responsible citizens.
Right. And so is that the answer to the approach of kind of the next wave of tyranny that we might be seeing, is individuals coming together? Can we come together?
ARC, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And the acronym is ARC, and ARC is a good acronym. It has echoes of the Ark, the biblical Ark, which is a container that allows people to withstand the trials and tribulations of life, to navigate through the flood, and to preserve. And ARC is also, it's like there's a lifetime arc, which is the trajectory moving forward. And so ARC's a good name. And so we had to scrap about that a fair bit, but the consequence of that was, well, a name that made everybody happier than all the other names that we had put forward.
Well, and that's so funny, right? Okay, we'll get to the story arc and the arc reference of the Bible, but it's funny also because the question is, can we get together? Can we? Or maybe even the question is, how can we as individuals get together? This group of individuals came together to try to answer that question, and then they are fighting about what to name the organization. That's like the irony of the state of affairs that we're in. What can bring us together? I come at this from a biblical Christian worldview, so I think the person of Jesus is the only answer to that. Actual real contact with the person of Jesus in your life is the only way that we can overcome the ego and pride and whatever else that leads to conflict, selfishness that leads to conflict among us, and sort of die to ourselves in order to participate in a story that's bigger than any one of us as individuals. So it's ironic that they're fighting over the name as they come together to try to bring people together and stave off tyranny. Okay, so the biblical arc, I don't know if this is any better. The biblical arc is an interesting one because it's a vessel for salvation. This is how God saves humanity from humanity's self. Like sin has entered the world. Civilization has de-evolved into chaos and disorder. There's all kinds of evil going on, and God's like, look, I can't let you guys destroy yourselves, so I'm gonna build an ark. So it's something that points us to the eventual salvation that we have in Christ. It is a vessel for salvation that allows humanity to rise above the chaos that comes as a result of our sin and eventually deliver us onto freedom. Now, Noah is an interesting character because he's flawed. So the whole ark narrative in the Bible leaves you wanting a better salvation story. So there's that. I think it's appropriate. And then the story arc. This is a fun one because I love literature. I love classical literature. You might have noticed that with the Socrates reference already, but the epic journey, you can think of Dante's Divine Comedy. The epic journey is a combination of tragedy and comedy. Tragedy starts high and ends low. It usually ends in a funeral or a death. But comedy starts low and ends high, which is usually a wedding or a feast. And that is the epic story that we find in Scripture. And is it a powerful enough story? I think it is, but it can't be just accepted from a utilitarian standpoint. It has to be accepted because it's true, whether you believe, it's like either you believe it's true or not, but we can't just say it's a nice, clever story and we can use it as a foundation for good government. The power of that story is when people see that it's true, believe it, and allow it to change them, and then they live their lives according to that story, that narrative. So you become a part of a much bigger narrative than you ever could, right? That's the whole point of that. So I don't know if this window made any sense, but I figured better than being in this little corner over here.
So welcome aboard the Ark if you're interested. And this is the statement of vision and invitation. It starts with, I'll tell you the structure of the proclamation or the vision statement, first of all. So when I wrote my book, Maps of Meaning, I analyzed the structure of redemptive stories. And your life is a redemptive story if you're fortunate, because you have a lot of trouble in your life, and yet you plow through and take care of that trouble, and that's a story of redemption. And the typical redemption story is something like, there's a stable state, a stable city, a stable family, a stable plan, and then that's disrupted by some cataclysmic event, the arrival of the barbarians, the entry of an interloper into a marriage, for example. Some fracture occurs. There's a descent into an intermediary period of chaos, and then there's the reestablishment of order that's of a higher order as a consequence. So you sort of go through life like this, and hopefully, order, chaos, order, chaos, order, chaos. And hopefully, as you do that, the order gets deeper and more profound, and you get to be better at mediating between order and chaos. And this is an order-chaos story, and it opens up with a description of the current state of order.
So there is that epic storyline. It's interesting because you see that in the person of Jesus, God descending in taking on the form of human flesh, dying, descending even into hell, but then the resurrection and the ascension. And yet the power of this story is not just in that it's factually true. Now, I believe that as a Christian person, but the power of this story is more like poetry. It takes you beyond what any just fact-based story narrative would have been able to do. It gives you a vision for life, a vision for eternity that allows you to still have hope in the world despite the chaos. And that's the arc story of Noah. It's certainly the story of Jesus, that we can stand up under the chaos and turmoil of life because we have a heavenly vision and a heavenly hope.
And we called that the good news. So I'm going to read this, as I said, and comment on it. Life has improved dramatically over the past few centuries for almost everyone, everywhere, at an ever-accelerating rate. Far more people are thriving on our planet than we could have imagined even mere decades ago. We live longer, are increasingly and globally literate, educated and connected, and enjoy unparalleled access to fresh water, food, energy, and resources. Now that's quite the miracle, because back in the 1960s, when we started to become aware of our increasing industrial power and ability to operate at a planetary level, let's say, we started to get worried about such things as whether, well, we were going to overpopulate the planet, and we were going to run out of food, and we were going to pollute everything into devastation, and the whole civilizational endeavor was going to collapse into a degenerate chaos. And there was plenty of doomsaying at that time. Plenty of people, Paul Ehrlich, for example, at Stanford, who wrote The Population Bomb, and the Club of Rome, who were the original apocalyptic doomsayers on the environmentalist front, claiming that by the year 2000, there'd be mass starvation, we'd be running out of basic commodities, and that life was going to get a hell of a lot worse quickly.
That's interesting. I think there's another narrative as well, which was the optimistic humanist view of the world, that we could achieve some sort of humanistic utopia. I think both have failed. So I'm not as optimistic about the West as Jordan Peterson might be, because one could say that the last 100 years were the worst. I mean, the most bloody and deadly the world has ever seen. I'll leave a link for this. I haven't read this book. Interesting article, though. The War of the Worlds, 20th Century Conflict, Descent of the West. The optimists among us who believe that the inevitable progress of man either forget or ignore the fact that the 20th century was the bloodiest, most destructive century in human history. The century's 2 world wars resulted in the deaths of at least 60 million people. The Russian Civil War killed another 5 or 6 million between them. The tyrannical regimes of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao killed at least another 60 million of their own citizens. This is a conservative number. I mean, I've heard that Stalin alone is guilty of a mass murder on that scale. That's not to say, what Mao or Hitler might have done. I think we don't know how many people died in the Soviet Union during that time. We just don't. They just shipped them off, train loads of them to starve and freeze to death in Siberia. I mean, it was the bloodiest 100 years we have ever seen. And why? He'll mention this, but it's because we've abandoned the idea of God. Nietzsche said, God is dead. We're all his murderers. And this is the result. We have no anchor point for civilization or for life. And so what's the answer? Where do we go from here?
And so we Despite all this good news, this undeniable progress, a shadow has emerged. An adversarial challenge to this state and process of expanding abundance, an emergent crisis of meaning and purpose. God is dead, or so the story goes, and the future is uncertain. 5 centuries of ascendant, reductionist enlightenment rationality have revealed that this starkly objective world lacks all intrinsic meaning. A century and a half or more of corrosive cultural criticism has undermined our understanding of and faith in the traditions necessary to unite and guide us. Well,
yeah, so a faith in traditions necessary to unite and guide us. That's what we're pointing to. A humanistic view of a utopia falls apart. It lacks the scope. It's not a full picture of reality, and so it fails. But something that is revealed to us by the creator of reality, the creator of the cosmos, that might be something to look into as a way to unite people with a shared common belief or a shared common faith. Those are very powerful things, even when some of those shared common beliefs and faiths have been found to be not true. So what could it mean if that shared faith is also the true structure of reality and we can unite behind it? What could that mean?
We underwent the scientific revolution, started 500 years ago, say, and it concentrated on delineation of the nature of the objective world. We found out that the heavens were other than what we had presupposed, and that the God we had imagined inhabiting those heavens did not appear in the starkly empty and barren, immense, vast landscape of the cosmos. And we believed that if you were sensible and abandoned your superstitions, that you'd see the world as the cold, dead, mechanistic, inert object of process that it most truly is. Well,
if you haven't read C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, Perelandria, it's time. This is a great series. You can kind of skip to the 3rd book in this series, but it's a reworking of kind of the medieval cosmography of heaven and earth, the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. I talked about this a little bit in the Joe Rogan, Eric Weinstein episode. And we went out into space and found out that it was dark and empty and vacuous, and then decided there was no God out there. But of course, we just didn't look far enough. I mean, yes, we... and I wonder, though, if looking into outer space as a dark, empty vacuum... again, this goes back to the kind of the Western approach to fairy tales, like, oh, those fairy tales, they're not true, so they're not meaningful. Well, they're incredibly meaningful. And yeah, it might not be true that God is in outer space the way we conceive of it, but that concept of a heavenly realm and an earthly realm, if we abandon that, I mean, look what has happened. I think we're struggling through the results of abandoning that worldview. We're just this globe floating through space, and there's no point or purpose to it. Yeah, I mean, we're suffering from the lack of that world. We're suffering from the effects of abandoning that heavenly and earthly concept. And that's ultimately where I think Jordan is going with this idea of a loss of meaning. The crisis that we're facing is a loss of meaning, and that loss of meaning, I think, now look, naturalism, rationalism, like, reason is good and it's a gift from God. I'm not anti-reason. I am an anti-rationalist in the sense that I don't think rationalism is the only thing. I think there's more to our ability to understand the world than just what I can conceive of with my mind. That has to be the case, because I can conceive of an infinite God. Where did that idea come from? Where did the idea of an infinite God come from in a finite mind? I possess it here in my finite mind, and yet what I'm thinking of is a actual infinite. Again, go back to the Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan. I talk about how Harry Potter might ever get to know J.K. Rowling. You could check that out. But that's, the loss of meaning crisis because we've abandoned those stories.
From my perspective, and I've thought about this deeply and talked about it with many wise people, This is a quasi-religious worldview replacement for our original traditional religious viewpoint. And it's predicated on a narrative, a story. We see the world through a story, inevitably. A description of the structures through which we see the world is a story. The apocalyptic environmentalist ethos is a story, and it has characters, and here's the story.
And it's limited, right? So the apocalyptic environmentalist story is one predicated on naturalism and humanism, and that's all there is. But a better story takes into consideration that this world is not all there is, and the material world is not all there is. That's a better story, a more powerful story through which we could build something like what Jordan is saying. He calls it a quasi-religious replacement. I don't know how to unpack that much more. I mean, that's a bit of a strange statement. I don't want a quasi-religion. I'm not interested in religion, but I certainly don't want a quasi-religious replacement for what could be true belief in true things. I would rather just believe in true things and allow the truth to set me free, allow the truth to be able to build community that can withstand the tyranny, that can overthrow tyranny.
The narrative generating these messages, quasi-religious in its structure and intensity, paints a dismal existential picture. The individual is a rapacious, predatory, parasitical consumer. Too many mouths to feed. Society, even the little society of the family, is an oppressive, tyrannical despoiler. Marriage is a patriarchal institution, an exploitative patriarchal institution. All our economic interactions are nothing but the manifestation of a corrupt will to power. And that's the proper reading of history and the current moment. And nature herself is a hapless, fragile, virginal victim in need of continual sympathy and protection. For our sins, so the story goes, the horsemen of the apocalypse are to be loosed upon us, and justly so. The ultimate Malthusian nightmare is about to be realized. The planet is unsustainably and unforgivably overpopulated. There is simply too much fundamentally pathological human activity. Plague, political anarchy, and starvation await us all. Malthus was a biologist who made the observation that under natural circumstances, populations of living organisms tended to expand through reproduction to the point where they consumed all available resources and then precipitously collapsed. Now, in a dynamic natural environment, the deer don't multiply to the point where they eat all the everything that they could forage for because they're held in check by predators. So you see, in principle.
To add a little bit to that, yes, the deer are held in check because there is a predator out there to hold the deer population in check. But also the deer is not, humanity is special within creation. We're made in God's image, and so we're capable of much more than just the kind of cause and effect, action, reaction, balance that we do see in nature. So I agree with Jordan to some extent, but I would extend it past just deer and, mountain lions.
A balancing of some sort emerge in complex, dynamic natural environments. But left to their own devices, unchecked, the Malthusian nightmare emerges. The yeast in the Petri dish will consume all the agar, and then all of it will die. And that's a biological model. And it's a model that's valid under some conditions. But we're not yeast, human beings. And we're not yeast because we can let our ideas die instead of us. And what that means is that if we do stupid, destructive things, we can learn to stop doing them, and we can get more efficient, and we can get wiser, and we can make more with less. And we've done that consistently throughout our entire biological, throughout the entire duration of our existence as a species. And there's no evidence whatsoever that we have got less good at that. In fact, quite the contrary. And so the economist's rejoinder to the Malthusian biologists is resources are not defined by their finitude in the manner you presume, because they're...
Yeah, so a lot of people have adopted that model and have then used that model to push their own ideas. There's not enough resources, there's too many people, and yet the answer to that, the response to that is humanity is capable of innovation. And is it really the Is the population the problem, or is it lack of innovation? This is a great book. This is a great book, by the way, Discipling the Nations. It is kind of a missions book, but Darrell Miller, who is taught under Francis Schaeffer, we'll get to Schaeffer, applies some biblical Christian worldview to this type of conversation. For the evolutionary secularists, Somalia is a classic example of too many people and too few resources. This is what Jordan Peterson is talking about. Somalia has no reason, and this book is a little bit old. It's a little bit dated. I'll get the date for it. Somalia has no resources to speak of. That's not entirely true, but yeah, 9.9 million people. Again, that's probably outdated. Or 16 per square kilometer live in this destitute country on the Horn of Africa. This is a good test of the secular stories. Japan, with about the same land mass and the same lack of natural resources, is, however, rich. Even more damning to the evolutionist argument is that Japan has 335 people per square kilometer, or 21 times as many people as Somalia. And you can compare this to other places. This is basically what we have been taught, is that there are too many people for the slice of pie. Every time you add a person, the slice of the pie must get smaller. And that is assuming that humanity can't be innovative. The biblical model would look at humanity as saying, well, the more people we have, the more virtue, the more potential for innovation, the more potential solutions, because people are made in the image of God. We are rational. We can understand the world. We can use the information coming at us, and we can come up with solutions. So you can look at some of these other comparisons that he does. Again, the book is called Discipling the Nations, and it's phenomenal when you actually look at the stats and realize the whole population problem is likely the opposite of what we're being told.
There is no upper limit to the scope of human ingenuity, especially if it's conjoined with the appropriate governance that makes cooperative ingenuity both possible and more likely.
If combined with the appropriate governance, I would also add combined with virtue. You need to have a population of virtuous people. Again, the more people, the more virtue, the more people, the more potential for innovation, guided and directed in the right way because of virtue. Now, the opposite is true. Where there is vice, where there is evil, where there is sin, I mean, the more people, then yeah, the more possibility for destruction and chaos. And that's why we need an answer, like badly, right?
So, for those of you who are thinking that we should be following the science and that the science is necessarily Malthusian, then I would say you don't know as much about science as you might need to know to make such a claim.
Yeah, and again, just check out that Darrell Miller book. I will link it.
In any case, from this Malthusian perspective, the ultimate nightmare is about to be realized. The planet is unsustainably and unforgivably overpopulated. There's too much pathological human activity. Plague, political anarchy, and starvation await us all. It is, in consequence, high time to repent and change our errant ways, to admit in defeated shame that our current social and industrial enterprises are corrupt and unsustainable, to radically revolutionize all traditional forms of conduct and governance, to question even the propriety of bringing new devouring mouths into this world, and to accept without resistance the limits to growth and opportunity made increasingly mandatory by a coterie of concerned and hypothetically expert elites. Well, what's the problem? Well, part of the problem is a panicked response to a hypothetical emergency can be far worse than the hypothetical emergency itself. And given what we all just did when the hypothetical COVID pandemic hypothetically emerged, we should give a real serious second thought to panicking and running off a cliff in the same manner as a consequence of the Chicken Little sky is falling doomsayers who are proclaiming that the emergency justifies their acquisition of all the power.
Yeah. So courage, again, courage is a virtue, and courage is the response to tyranny. We need a courageous group of people, a courageous population of people. Then the question is, where does that virtue come from? We'll get to that. We've already talked about Jesus, so I clued you into that one.
A relationship, let's say with a man, that becomes entirely questionable. I mean, then it's what, sex and companionship, and that's not nothing, but that might not be enough to unite people in a manner that allows them to maintain the intense social bonds that are necessary to keep us free of terror and anxiety and hopeful into the future. And then for men, for young...
Well, yeah, so are those bonds strong enough? Do we need something that's even stronger? Those are strong bonds, but do we need something even stronger?
Men in particular, it's like, well, all their ambition is nothing but a manifestation of patriarchal oppression and the very oppression that's destroying the planet. And so if they get up and attempt to move forward, all they're doing is contributing to the catastrophic mess that human beings, that cancer on the planet, have already and always made of the planet. And so what do you expect on the behalf of young people? And you should expect exactly what you get, which is a radical increase in depression and anxiety, a radical elimination of their sense of agency, growing sense of hopelessness and despair, all of which is being forced upon them, and even the abandonment of the entire sexual enterprise. 30% of people in...
Yeah, so so we were told to abandon our stories because they sound, well, at least the biblical story sounds like a fairy tale, and that's because it's not written, it's written as a story for a reason, and we were told to abandon our stories, and what we got was a loss of meaning and a descent into anxiety, fear, and depression. That's really the current state. I would say that has been going on since the Death of God movement really took hold. And I hope that people see this. I hope that people see how destructive these ideas are, that these ideas have consequences, that the result of the humanity that's in front of us, the society that's in front of us, is a result or a consequence of those ideas. And some of it's good. I mean, it's not all bad. I would say that even during the COVID lockdowns and all that stuff, I mean, there were glimmers of hope. There were veins of hope. And I even see it today in the sense of like spiritual awakening going on, even as I listen to Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and some of these people.
We've talked about the current situation optimistically. We talked a little bit about the crisis that we're facing existentially and practically, and the dangers that might emerge because of overreaction to that hypothetical crisis. We'll talk about the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship a bit, and what we're tentatively offering and what we have as an invitation to the table.
Will it work? Yeah.
The catastrophizing must stop. It is existentially perilous to insist upon the impending end of the world in this doom-saying manner, lest the ensuing panicked tyranny produce exactly the result that is in principle most feared.
Okay, this is where I want to share with you something from Hebrews chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he, Jesus, himself likewise also partook of the same. He became flesh, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil. So there's more going on to this fight that we're fighting. And Jesus might free those who through the fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. It is the fear of death, impending doom, and catastrophe that keeps people surrendering freedom for the sake of at least even a felt security. And that's how tyrants gain power, but that's also how we lose the spiritual battle that's going on. It's not just against flesh and blood. It's a battle of powers and principalities of this dark world. And that this passage clues us in to help us understand more what's going on here.
Well, why local, national, and international? Well, there's historical precedent for the conception of the good governance that's neither tyranny nor degeneration into chaos. And that's something like distributed responsibility. Individuals who are taking responsibility for their own lives, who are educated and attentive and productive and generous enough to take care of themselves. And then you hope that if they get good enough at that, they can extend their hand and start taking care of someone else. So maybe you get married and you take care of your wife and she takes care of you, and that's a pretty good deal for both of you. And then the two of you are productive and generous enough with each other so that you can now take care of some kids, and then you put your family together. And so your family's solid and well constituted, and you have a little bit of leftover resource so that you could be of aid to your local community. And so the local community thrives with its level of responsibility. And then while the town made of communities thrives, and the province made of cities thrives, and then the nation made of provinces thrive, and then what's ever left at the international level can make itself minimally manifest. And that's
minimally manifest for, national or whatever. Is he describing, he's describing a community, and for me, it sounds a lot like a church. Now, I say that, and I have to immediately qualify it with the way the church should be. Of course, it's not perfect. There is, and that's maybe the point, is this whole conversation is fixated on the world and the natural world, the earthly world, and the truth is that the utopia, it's not possible here on this earth in this time. It is a promise given to us by God that every tear will be washed away, and we will sit down at a heavenly banquet, and everything is restored back to its proper place in that heavenly vision, in the God's heavenly kingdom. That is possible, but a kingdom, a humanistic utopian kingdom here on earth, is going to de-evolve. Even if you have really tight-knit communities, as it expands, you have to have a foundation strong enough to support the inevitable pressure that humanity will put on it. I want to add something really quick from Francis Schaeffer's book, How Should We Then Live? He compares ancient Rome to our situation today. I think it's really helpful. The Roman gods were amplified humanity and not divinity. So Rome had a foundation not built on a divine concept of God, but just this amplified humanity, basically bigger people. The Roman gods they bickered and they fight and they're selfish and all the rest. And so Rome eventually fell. The Romans had no infinite God. This being so, they had no sufficient reference point, nothing big enough or permanent enough to bear the strains of life individually or publicly. So it was the Christians who were able to resist the religious mixture, syncretism, and the effects of the weakness of the Roman culture. Speaks to the strength of the Christian worldview. The strength rested on God's being an infinite personal God and his speaking in the Old Testament, in the life and teachings of Christ, and in the then growing New Testament. Thus, Christians not only had knowledge about the universe and mankind that people cannot find out by themselves, so it's revealed to them. We didn't construct this view of God. The biblical Christian view of God is not a construction of the human mind. But they had an absolute universal values by which to live and by which to judge the society and the political state in which they lived. And they had grounds for the basic dignities and values of the individual as unique in being made in the image of God. I think this is the vision forward. This is it. And the early church demonstrated that. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is no hope for humanity. So as always, I hope that can be a helpful kind of deep dive, unpacking some pretty serious ideas and some pretty serious questions. It does take time and it requires that time. So if you're here at the end of this, I love you and thank you for being a part of this community. I mean, this would be what Jordan Peterson is talking about, a group of people who take these things seriously, but then do something about it, rather than, just talking, which I guess is ironic because that's what I'm doing here. I'm also building a homestead and trying to raise 3 kids. So thank you for being here, and I will catch you in the next one. Are you going to join the ark? I don't know. I'm already on the ark, baby.